Hi, everyone. My name is William Wright, and I am from Smart About Money, part of Student Success here at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And today we are fortunate enough to be talking with the Assistant Director of Financial Services, Kale, and we are just going to talk about the different aspects of life after college and what that means for our student loans. We're really excited to have you here and jump into some of the complexities of student loans and understanding what happens after you graduate.
Perfect. Thanks for having me. I look forward to it. I'm happy to answer all kinds of questions that come up in regards to what happens to student loans once students graduate from college.
Absolutely. So let's start probably kind of the beginning. So if you're a junior or you're a senior and you're kind of thinking about what happens after I graduate, I'm not really sure what I want to do, but I'm going to be getting out of college regardless. So could we start there and think, what happens when I graduate? What happens to my transition from student to working adult? What happens with my student loan specifically?
Yeah, great question. So pretty much when you graduate, let's say you graduate in May or something like that, then you have about 6 months after that, and it's called your grace period. So imagine like a clock that you have, and you have about 6 months, and that time period gradually gets used up. And after the 6 months, that's the point where you have to start making payments. Now, you might be curious about the payment amount that you're going to have to make, and that can fluctuate depending on how much money that you took out. So let's assume that you took out student loans throughout your college career, so freshman year through senior year. So you maybe took out 5,500 your freshman year, and then 6,500 sophomore year, and then junior and senior year, you took about 7,500 out. So the total for that should be around $27,000. And by the time you graduate, there might be some interest added up on top of that. So average payments when students graduate, if they go on a standard repayment plan, might be about $300 a month or so. So just kind of put that in your mind in terms of preparation that 6 months after you graduate, assuming that you're not going to grad school, then you might have a payment for about $300 a month or so straight out of college.
Okay, awesome. And you kind of touched on that. So two things is the 6 month repayment period. What happens if I under-enrolled one semester and was a part-time student? And then you mentioned that the standard payment plan is, you've taken out a specific amount, but what kind of other types of repayment plans are there?
Yeah, good question. So the key thing in terms of enrollment is that you want to be in at least 6 credits. So that's kind of the magic number. You want to be in at least 6 credits. And then once you fall below that 6 credit mark, then the clock starts ticking. And when I say the clock, I'm referring to that 6 month time period that we talked about earlier. So usually this isn't an issue over the summer because some people are like, well, why isn't this an issue in the summer, right? So it's not an issue in the summer because a 6 month time period doesn't complete. So as long as you don't complete that time period, you're able to reset that clock. So this is my go-to analogy. I just imagine a clock, right? Just kind of ticking away. So let's say that you do drop below 6 credits. Let's say that you're in maybe just one course, so that's about 3 credits or so. So in that case, the clock does start ticking, right? Unless you go through your professor and get like a load override and then it's qualifying as 6 credits, right? So if there's certain exceptions that could work, but let's assume that you're in 3 credits and then the clock starts ticking. Then you're going to get notified. You're going to get something probably in your email saying that you need to complete exit counseling and that your repayment is going to start at XYZ date. And this might be your monthly payment amount. So you're going to get that kind of information. So let's say that you took your spring semester off, let's say. So then the 6 month time period came to you, maybe June or July or so, right? So then you might be making payments from July through September. And the reason I say September is because that's when you start your fall semester, right? So as long as you go back into full enrollment, and if you're in at least 6 credits, then there's a system communication that happens, and then that clock is able to stop. So then you're not really required to continue making payments. So that's kind of how that works if you do fall below 6 credits.
Okay, awesome. And now you kind of touch on it a little bit about, if I fall below 6 credits and there's this exit counseling and I'll be getting some notices, can you just kind of talk about where do I even, so graduation is coming or I've gotten that notice. Who does this notice come from? Does that come from UMass, and is UMass the holder of all my loans? And how do I figure out how much I owe?
Yeah, great question, right? Like, where is this money coming from, right? So this money is all coming from the federal government. So these are federal student loans, and this is where it gets a little bit weird and tricky. So let's say there's $10,000 that you get from the federal government. So the federal government sends that money usually directly to the university, and the university disperses it onto the bill, or if you have a refund, so you can use it towards rent, it would get dispersed that way. So the government, I guess to simplify, the government doesn't really have enough staff to do customer service, and they can't really do collections, right, of repayment. So what the government decided to do is, hey, we're going to kind of service this out. And there's going to be a lot of different organizations that are going to be in charge of collecting that money. Just to give you an example, there's organizations like Great Lakes, Fed Loan Servicing, Nelnet, and there's a bunch of other ones. There's a lot of different names. So you could have Great Lakes, and your friends or roommate could have Nelnet or something like that. So it it really can depend, and you could end up having a different organization that's in charge of collecting that money. So you'll eventually receive communication from them as well, saying, hey, you're about to go into repayment. Make sure you sign in and create an account with us. And then they're going to give you a breakdown of what your monthly payment is going to be. And they're going to be able to kind of break everything down for you.
Okay. And now, so if I'm a new student and getting a car loan and stuff, I'm just making one lump sum payment to my institution. For student loans, do I have to maybe send different payments every month to different loan institutions?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in most cases, it's all going to be through the federal government, right? So this can kind of fluctuate if, let's say, you have private loans too, right? Because then you have to make payments to the private lender. But let's just go ahead and assume that it's all with the federal government and it's all the federal unsubsidized loan. So in that case, it's super straightforward. Let's say that you get signed up and you get matched up with an organization called Great Lakes, and they're in charge of collecting all your payments. So in terms of steps, they're going to reach out to you and they're going to say, hey, in November, you're going to have to make a payment for $280, and that's going to be your monthly payment. So that's pretty much it. And you just have to make $280 a month in terms of payments. And then you just keep doing that for a 10-year period. And then until your debt does eventually get paid off. Which makes me want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier that I wasn't able to get to. So in terms of student loans, right? The one thing that I really like to emphasize is that you should not go into default. I really want to emphasize this. With student loans through the federal government, you should not go into default. And what I mean by that is you shouldn't miss a single payment because there's some pretty solid plans that the federal government offers. So no matter what your circumstances, let's say risk of homelessness, or there's no income, or there's a reduction in income, any circumstance that you might be going through, it's with the federal government. So usually there's a plan. So I want to make sure I briefly touch on what some of these plans are. So I have a list right here. So there's the income-based repayment plan, which is typically about 10 to 15% of your income. There's plans like that where you're able to reduce your monthly payments. So let's say you're not able to do $300 a month, then you can work with them, and then you might be able to reduce your monthly payments to, let's say, like $150 a month or something like that. So there's a plan like that. And there's also something called forbearance where you actually don't have to make any payments, right? I don't necessarily recommend this, right? Because the interest does accumulate if you are in forbearance. The benefit is, yeah, you're not making any payments, but the interest is still going to be accumulating. So that's something to keep in mind. And then there's other specific plans like the revised pay as you earn, which is typically about 10% of your income. So it's very similar to income-based repayment plans. The key thing is that if you're looking into like public service loan forgiveness, that's where things might get tricky, and these plans are more important. So if you do have specific questions that come up, you can definitely give us a call, and we're able to assist you with that. And then another one that exists is the extended repayment plan, which is pretty much stretching it out to 25 years, right? So pro and con, the payment might be lower, but there's a lot more interest that's going to accumulate if you stretch it out. So those are some things to keep in mind. But the key thing that I really want to emphasize is that you shouldn't go into default because there's always going to be some type of a plan with the federal government. Private sector, the private sector is a whole different ballgame, right? It's a private, organization, so they're going to have different tactics in terms of collecting the money, and they're definitely not as lenient compared to the federal government. So I'll make sure to emphasize that.
And now, in the case, if it's we're not living in a perfect world here, and I am at risk of default, what do you recommend? Should I reach out to my loan service provider immediately, or what kind of steps should I take if I think that might be something that I can't afford to make my payment?
Yeah. So you can reach out to your loan servicer. You're spot on, and you can call them and just explain the circumstance that you're in, and then they might give you an explanation of what kind of plans exist. You can also go to studentaid.gov, which is a federal website, and they'll be able to list all the different options that you'll have as well. One thing that I do want to say is that some of these loan servicers may not have a solid foundation in terms of training, right? So they might have just hired somebody. Maybe they've already been, only been trained for like a week or something, and they might be recommending that you go into forbearance or something like that, as opposed to an income-based repayment plan, which might not necessarily be ideal because there's going to be more interest accumulation, right? So I don't want to say, don't trust them. I just want to say, make sure to do your own research too. Be a little bit cautious. And when they do make a recommendation, you can kind of do your own research around that plan and see if that really does work for you. There was like a legal case where an organization got in trouble because they're consistently recommending forbearance as opposed to income-based repayment, because the phone calls were a lot shorter if it was a forbearance, right? And time is money. So the shorter phone calls, the more profit that they might make. So there's some things like that that's come up with the servicers. So, you can always call us too, right? Let's say it's 5 years down the line, you're not sure about something, you can call us back. You can call, UMass Financial Aid. We're still happy to help you. Ask away on any questions about repayment or public loan service forgiveness, and we'll try to help.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, utilizing financial aid post-grad is one that I definitely would not have thought of, and I don't think a lot of students know of. But because I just want to touch on a point, depending on when someone listens to this, right now we are in COVID times, and forbearance is not always the best thing in the private sector. But can you talk a little bit about the forbearance we're in right now with 0% interest rates at the federal government level, and what it might mean when you're graduated and you're looking at forbearance? What are the two differences that you're seeing?
Yeah, so the forbearance that we're in right now is pretty awesome, right? Everything's 0%. So even if you had a 5%, loan right now, it's standing at 0%. So there's no interest accumulation happening whatsoever. So there's different ways that you could look at this, right? It's a fantastic opportunity to potentially pay down your debt while it's 0%. There's no interest accumulating. Or you could try to allocate your funds in a different way. You could try to put more money into your emergency savings, right? Let's say that you're used to making $300 a month in terms of payments towards student loans. You could technically stop making those payments and put that exact same dollar amount into your emergency savings, so that once that clock, I shouldn't use the term clock here because I used it earlier and this is going to work a little bit differently. Once the federal government takes off the forbearance, right, which is in this example is going to be October 1st. So at that time, you would have like savings set aside, and you have like the $300 a month that you already put aside that you could suddenly dump into your student loans if you wanted to. So I would say that's a possible option as well that students are going to have. And there might have been another piece of the question that you're asking that I missed.
Yeah, so that answers it, what we're kind of in now. But just to kind of re-solidify what you were saying. So forbearance, though, now it's like so great because it's at 0% interest rate. But
Yeah.
if I'm 5 years out of college and I'm no longer able to make my payments and they offer forbearance, it's not going to be at a 0% interest rate.
Yeah, spot on. And I'm glad you brought that up, right? So right now it is 0%, which is fantastic. But let's say, you have a 4% interest rate, and you go into forbearance because of your circumstance changing, like you lose your job, whatever the case might be. that 4% is still going to be working, right? So the interest is still going to be accumulating. So the more time that you spend there, the more interest that will accumulate. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And kind of touching on that, it's really interesting thing because sometimes we'll get a phone call and it's somebody that graduated 5 years prior or something like that, and they'll ask questions about repayment, and they might say like, how does this affect my credit, like what happens if I pay it off, or what happens if I miss a payment, that kind of a thing. So yeah, again, if you have questions that come up, reach out to us and we can help too, right? We're a resource for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, something to realize, your credit can definitely be adversely affected, missing payments and things like that. So always reach out, especially to financial aid. Post-grad is an important one. But also being in COVID, we've heard a lot of lawmakers talk about student loan forgiveness. And I'd love to understand maybe from a financial aid perspective, whether that probability, it's hard to speculate because we're not lawmakers ourselves, but what do you think students who are graduating or about to graduate should really focus on rather than maybe waiting for someone to forgive the student loans? As great as that would be, it's been talked about for a couple years.
Yeah. um, this is definitely a tricky one, right? So I think there's different ways that this could play out. So the probability part, like we don't know what the odds are of this thing actually going through. But at the same time, right, I can see both perspectives, right? Let's say you have $10,000 in student loans and you hit the lottery, pay it off, right? Awesome, you just paid it off. But then like 2 months after that, you find out that, the government's going to forgive it. So then you kind of lost $10,000 in terms of benefit there, right? So I think there's different ways that this could play out. And I think the dollar amount that you have in terms of student loans is going to have an effect on this. So if you were a student that just took out federal loans throughout your college career, you took out $27,000, let's say, and post interest accumulation, let's say it's sitting at $29,000, you can still pay it down. You can still pay it down to $10,000, right? I think they're floating two things, right? $10,000 forgiveness or 50,000 forgiveness. 50, I think, is going to be tough. I'd be super surprised if that goes through. I mean, if it does, that's great. That's awesome, right? But I think 50 is going to be tough. I think 10, maybe, and I think they're also going to create some thresholds, right? How much money are you making? Things like that. So in an example where you have $27,000, I think paying it down is fine, because I don't think that full 27K is going to get forgiven. But if you think it will, it's your call, right? I just want to make sure I provide the right information here and you just have the facts that you can make a determination with. But if it were me and if I had $27,000, I might pay it down. If I had the ability to, I might pay it down to around $10,000, and then the rest of it I would probably hoist towards cash savings, right? And put it into emergency savings. If it does get forgiven, awesome, great. If it doesn't, well, I have the emergency savings, and I have also money set aside that I can use towards that. I think there's different ways that you can approach the strategy, but I'm super excited to see what happens. But this is like it's a super deep thing, right? Like student loans. And I should emphasize, right? I have student loans. Me and my wife, we had over $100,000 in student loans. She went to medical school, so that's a big lump sum, right? And then now it's down to probably like $70,000 or so. But it's not just us. Everybody's got student loans, and it would be a massive relief from a student loan standpoint. But there's a lot of other philosophical points that could come in here too. So it's definitely a complex issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, just reiterating the point, everyone has student loans. Education is increasingly more expensive, and it's really hard to pay for it out of pocket. But one thing I want to touch on is, as someone who will graduate soon and work with a lot of people who are graduating soon, you touched on your wife went to medical school. So after her undergraduate, if she had loans, what happens if you enroll in graduate school? Do students, are they expected to continue to make payments? Can they put them in kind of deferment? How does that work?
Yeah, deferment. So you go to grad school, you're in at least 6 credits, and you're enrolled. You go into deferment. So you're not required to make any payments.
does the interest accumulate? Yeah, yeah, it does. Let's assume that you have unsubsidized loans. So the interest will accumulate while you're in school. And that can be part of the issue, right? So if you go to medical school, that could be, let's say, like a 3 to 4 year program. And, if that's the case, then the interest is going to accumulate the whole time you're there. And also you're going to have to maybe take out more loans while you go to medical school, right? So in terms of making payments, no, you won't have to, because you can go into deferment with the federal loans, but the interest will accumulate while you're in school.
Okay. And now to segue that to maybe I'm not going right to grad school and maybe I'm going to go into the workforce. I know that some private sector employees have some benefits for student loans, like payments and stuff. But can you kind of talk about what are maybe some of the benefits of working in the public sector, if that's where I want to end up? What kind of loan programs do they have?
Yeah. So let's say that you go into a nonprofit organization, and what window opens up is that there's this program called the Public Service Loan Forgiveness, right? And it might be in the media recently by saying that not a lot of people have been able to go through on this. But part of the issue is it's still a relatively new program. And in order to get forgiveness, you need at least 10 years, right? And if this program got pushed through in 2009, 2019 is going to be the starting point. So more and more people recently are starting to qualify for PSLF, Public Service Loan Forgiveness. So it's starting to become a thing. It used to not really be a thing, but now it is actually starting to turn into a thing. The design of it is better. It got a lot of negative media, and I think funding went towards it, and it maybe improved. So I do want to emphasize that it's a thing. I do encourage you to do research, but if you go into PSLF, typically it's making payments for 10 years, and you have to be working in a certain environment, let's say like a nonprofit organization. Let's say you're working for like a nonprofit hospital. So that could be a circumstance where you could qualify for PSLF. And there's different strategies that you can go through in order to maximize that. You can go on your income-based repayment, and then hopefully after 10 years, you're able to save a good chunk of money and have some of the loans forgiven. So it is a program that exists. So I definitely encourage you to do more research or reach out to us if you're in like a specific situation and you're unsure about how it works.
Absolutely. And in the private sector, there's also usually some incentives and stuff like that through companies offering like portions of loan payments and stuff like that. So would you recommend that like when students get out and stuff like that, whether it's public or private sector, to really speak with some of the human resource agents and stuff like that to figure out what programs they might have?
Yeah, and I think let's say that you're going to go into the private sector. Let's say that you're about to go work for Google. Good for you, right? So you're about to start with Google. And what I do recommend as well is negotiating in that job interview process, because they want you, right? You want them, but they also want you. So you can always add in contingencies like, yeah, I'll sign this 3 year contract, but I also want you to pay off like 50% of my student loans within that time period as well, or I'd like you to make payments towards my student loans. So definitely negotiate, see if it's an option. Worst case scenario, you ask them and they say no, right? But you can definitely ask them and see if they're able to make payments on your student loans or if they can pay them for you. Yeah, I would say that would be one of the main things with the private sector. For the nonprofit sector, let's say, I'm trying to think of like an example with the student loan, but it slipped my mind. So if it comes back to me, I'll mention it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and then one quick thing just to tie back into, you talked about income-based repayment, and I know that you really encourage students to do some own research and stuff like that, but would you mind just giving like a quick high-level overview of that, whether you have to be in like a specific sector to get that, and if that's something you work out with your loan service provider, just any general information about that?
Yeah, so yeah, like I definitely touched on, definitely go on studentaid.gov. That's the federal website, and you can get more information on there as well. But let's say you work for an organization and you're making, let's say $20,000 to $30,000 a year, and it's super difficult to cover the payments that are being asked for. So then you can first talk to your servicer, and then figure out what payment plan might be the best that works for you. Is it going to be the income-based repayment where it's between 10 and 15%? That part is definitely going to be a case to case, and different circumstances could change which plan you should go on. But yes, it's definitely one of the options that you have. I can't go into too much detail because I think that's the point where there could be so many different situations that come up. But talking to your servicer and then reaching out to any resources that you know of, if you think that's a circumstance that fits your situation, then definitely reach out and they'll be able to give you more information around that.
Okay, awesome. And then kind of just one other thought is there's a lot of talk about, within student groups and stuff like that about, if they go to grad school, you're still a dependent maybe on your parents' tax situation for like health insurance and stuff like that. But would you mind, even at the undergrad level, maybe talking about some of the differences about independent and dependent status?
Yes. So there's a lot of benefits to being an independent student. You do have the ability to take out more student loans, and your income's probably not going to be that high. So if you go to a state institution, you might be able to qualify for some more need-based aid. So that could be things like grants, right? And that's grants that you don't have to pay back. The system that's currently in place does make it fairly difficult to become an independent student. One of the exceptions is if you're over the age of 24. So that's one. You're married. You have a kiddo. There could be circumstances like that that could qualify you as a independent student, and that could potentially enable you to get more need-based aid. But I do want to emphasize that that's specifically for an undergraduate student situation. Once you become a graduate student, you're automatically considered an independent student. And you can actually only gain access to federal loans. There are some institutions that might provide some need-based aid as a graduate program, but it's definitely rare. And in terms of how much you can take out as a grad student, it's about $20,500 per year that you can take out in federal loans.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so like kind of my last point here is like addressing maybe some of those misconceptions or common things that you might hear as a financial aid officer. A lot of students might be under the impression that there's no difference between independent and dependent when you get out to graduate school and stuff like that, like you just addressed. But what are maybe some things that you commonly hear that students maybe aren't considering post-graduation, like some common misconceptions or things like that? Not to put you on the spot or anything.
I wouldn't necessarily say misconceptions, but maybe lack of knowledge and having like a foundational knowledge base in terms of how it works after you graduate. And that's partly why we want to push out material like this, so more students have more information about this, and that you have contact information, and you're able to reach out and ask questions if there are any. But yeah, give me some. Do you have any?
Well, so like maybe not a misconception perhaps, but maybe like what it would be from a financial aid perspective if I'm a student getting ready to graduate and I really just have no idea where any of these student loans are. I know that I've taken out a mix of grants and loans. What is the process with financial aid that I really start to understand that? Because some students might be under the impression that like you're kind of on your own. Financial aid only helps with reading like your award letters and stuff, but how can financial aid really help if I'm about to graduate and really don't understand where any of this stuff is?
Yeah. You can definitely make an appointment with us, or you can call us and just tell us, I have no idea what I'm doing, right? I'm about to graduate. I have no idea how this stuff works. I don't know how the student loans work. How do I know how much I took out? What's the interest rate? What kind of loans did I take out? How much time do I have to pay it off, right? These are really good questions that you might just be absolutely clueless about. And we're able to, we could go on Zoom and then do like a screen share and do a walkthrough on what things might look like. But also, since we're doing this on Zoom, let me kind of do a step-by-step. So step one would be to go to studentaid.gov. That's like your go-to website, and you can click on the button that says log in. So once you're in studentaid.gov, you can actually get a perfect breakdown of what kinds of student loans that you've taken out. It will tell you freshman year, you took out unsubsidized loans, $5,500, interest rate 2.75%. It will give you a really good breakdown, and you can just click on it to figure that out. And if you click on details, it will also say your servicer is Great Lakes, for example. This is their phone number, 1-800 blah, 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 blah. So it's going to give you all that information on there. So I think the key thing is, and like I said, it's going to be your step one is go to studentaid.gov and you're able to get that bundle in terms of all the information on how much loans you have and things like that. And then step two is coming up with your own plan, right? How am I going to tackle this? And part of this is exit counseling that gets sent out to you, and you'll be able to kind of contemplate that. But how do you want to approach this? Are you going to be making the full payments for the 10-year period, right? Because you're going to have a lot of different potential plans that you can go on as well. And then, once you have that plan, step three is pretty much execute, right? If you're, middle to high income and you just want to pay it off, go ahead and pay it off. So that's something that you can do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's some really good advice and just a good step-by-step thing. In the last closing minutes, is there any other thing you might want to have covered, or any last minute thoughts or anything?
Yeah, I think the key thing is if you're not sure about something, just ask, right? I think a lot of us have a hard time asking for help, and it's all right. If you don't know it, just reach out to us or reach out to your servicer and just explain the situation and see if you can get some more information. And one thing to add, it came back to me earlier when I was stuck and I couldn't remember what it was. So when it comes to loan forgiveness, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a ratio that gets talked about in terms of should you try to go for public service loan forgiveness or should you not go for public service loan forgiveness, right? And typically it's when the debt is above 1.25 to 1.5 as a ratio above your income. So let's say you're making like $100,000 a year or so, and then it's at $150,000 in terms of loans, then it might be something to consider. But in most cases, financially and with interest accumulation, if it's $20,000, $15,000, you're making like 50K, then you can just pay it off. And this isn't necessarily advice saying that that's what you should do, but this is kind of like the general rule of thumb. Yeah, I just want to make sure I provide that information that just because PSLF exists, it doesn't mean that you should shoot for that and try to get it forgiven in 10 years, because by the time you go on the 10-year plan, even if you're on IBR, the income-based repayment, financially you might not benefit from it too much. And yeah, paying off debt, there's a massive psychological benefit to it, right? Whether it be a credit card or whether it be an auto loan, like whatever the expense might be, when you pay that off, that's an expense that you no longer have to make a monthly payment for, right? So it makes a massive psychological difference. So I'm glad that came back, and I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. But yeah, did you have any questions around it?
No, that's pretty clear. And echoing your point, once you pay that off, you regain that income. That just goes back into your income, rather than diverting it to loan payments and stuff like that. So that's a really important point.
I have one more thing. As we're wrapping up, let me just go ahead and recirculate my blood going to my brain.
Please.
So how it affects your credit too, right? So student loans do have an effect on your credit. When you graduate, you're going to start thinking about credit. Maybe you're already thinking about credit, which is awesome, right? So credit's important because, well, if you do decide to take out a loan at some point in your life, you're going to have a credit score. I was a little bit naive in undergrad, and I used to think, you know what, I'm just going to save up for everything. I'm going to pay cash for it. Surprise, surprise, right? I don't have $250,000 to just buy a house, right? You can't really do it. So you have to take out a loan. So if you have to take out a loan, you need a credit score. So how is it tied to your student loans, right? So it's going to go on your credit report that you've taken out all these student loans. On time, consecutive payments going towards your student loans is going to be a benefit on your credit, your score. It's going to help increase your score. It's also going to give you some history. There's some benefits there with student loans. And some things to keep in mind is that when you do pay off that student loan, if that's the only form of debt that you have on your report, there's a possibility that your score is going to suddenly drop, right? So let's say that You have $10,000 in loans, but you just won the lottery for $15,000, right? And you're like, I'm just going to pay it off. But you also want to buy a mortgage, right? Like you want to get a house right around the corner. You could pay this off, but if you do, and that's the only form of credit on your report, it can actually drop your score a fair bit, and it could hurt you in terms of what interest rate you're going to get. So it's just something important to keep in mind. And I knew this, right? But I still managed to make a mistake. So let me tell you my story. So when I had the unsubsidized loans on my account, I paid it down to about $200, and I left it at $200 because I knew that I was going to apply for a mortgage right around the corner. I thought that I was going to apply for a mortgage maybe within a month or two, but ended up being 4 months ahead or something like that. So what ended up happening is I didn't realize that the minimum payment that you had to make in that situation, even if you had a small balance, was $50 a month. So I ended up pretty much paying it way ahead of schedule. And then my credit score suddenly dropped by about 40 to 50 points, which is a massive drop. And that's even with other forms of credit on my account, like credit cards and things like that. So it was okay. It still kept me just above the number that I needed, which is a 760, in order to get a sufficient interest rate for the mortgage. But I just want to make sure I share that information, that I kind of prepared for it, but still made a mistake, right? So if you do have the ability to absolutely wipe out your loans, if you are looking for a mortgage or a car loan or something like that, just what you could do is find your oldest student loan, leave a teensy tiny balance on there. And then after you get your mortgage or your loan, go ahead, just wipe it off. Just go ahead and pay that off and you're good to go. So I just wanted to make sure I kind of brought it down how it's going to affect your credit, because that's a big part of life after you leave college.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and happy you mentioned it. Because as Smart About Money, on our aspect, we do a credit presentation, and we have a ton of different questions about building credit. Just like, oh, I have student loans and I don't have any credit cards. Should I get a credit card? Things like that. So I think that students now understand that there's a good balance of information on Smart About Money side, but also financial aid side, about really understanding some of the niche stuff about your student loans and some things that you might not just get from a quick read over on like a student loan information guide. So this has been super informative, and I really appreciate you taking the time and sitting with us, and just answering a ton of different questions that we've gotten in over the last couple months.
Yeah, I really appreciate this time that you made for me. And I think I've emphasized, reach out to us at Financial Aid, but also reach out to Sam, Smart About Money, because the amount of information that they provide, and can educate you on finance and life after college is incredible. So definitely utilize that resource as well.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And if you guys ever need like any form of contact or anything, we work really close with financial aid, specifically Kale. So feel free to reach out to Smart Out Money, and we can throw you towards financial aid or vice versa. So really, thank you again for this. This has been excellent and really informative.
Great. Thanks, everybody.